When you create a Flex application, the project automatically creates a folder known as the output folder, which has a default name of bin-debug. The bin-debug folder is populated with all of the generated files that are typically used in deploying a Flex application. But in Flex Builder 3, this bin-debug directory only contains the debug version of the application, not the final release version. In this video, I'm going to describe the contents of the bin-debug folder and also another folder called HTML template that's used for modeling the output of your Flex application. The bin-debug folder contains a history folder, and then it contains all of the generated application files. I'm going to focus on two of these files. Both have the same name as the original source code file, in this case Hello World or Travel Request, and have file extensions of .html and .swf. The .swf file, known as the SWF file, is the compiled application. For instance, if I have an application source code file called travelrequest.mxml, that results in a compiled application called travelrequest.swf. The SWF file is in the same format as would be generated when you build a Flash document using the Flash authoring environment. That is, it's an application that can be run and executed by the Flash player. The .html file of the same name is something we call the HTML wrapper file. At runtime, the browser opens the HTML file. The HTML file contains instructions that tell it to open the Flash player and then to load the application into the Flash player for execution. Let's take a look at the contents of the HTML file. I'm right-clicking on the file in the Flex Navigator view, or control-clicking on the Mac, and then selecting Open with Text Editor. Notice that if you just double-click on the file, you'll actually open it up in a web browser, and you'll be running the file right there within Flex Builder. If you want to see the file's source code, you have to right-click on it and open it with the appropriate editor. Now I'll double-click on the tab for the HTML file to expand it to full screen, and I'm going to describe the contents of this file and each section's purpose. The basic structure of this file is HTML. It's designed to be loaded into a browser. In the head section of the HTML file, there's a link element that links to a history.css file. I'll talk about history management in a much later video in this series, but briefly, it's a tool that allows you to manage navigation within the Flex application at runtime, and this history.css file manages the appearance of those tools. Next, within the head section, there's a script element with an src attribute pointing to a JavaScript file called acoetags.js. This is a link to a critical JavaScript file that's used to manage the presentation of the Flex application at runtime. Next is another script element, this one linking in a file called history.js. This JavaScript file is used to manage the history or the navigation of the application at runtime. Continuing down the application, notice in the globals section that there are three variables being declared: the required major version, the required minor version, and the required revision. This is how you instruct the browser and the Flash player, indicating which version of the Flash player is required to run your application. Applications built and delivered in Flex Builder 3 require a minimum of Flash Player 9028. Now, if you wanted to change which version of the Flash player you needed, you wouldn't change it here. I'll show you where to make that change in a little bit. You always leave this generated HTML file alone. Further down in the application within the body section, there's some JavaScript code that detects which version of the Flash player is installed on the user's machine. If the user has the right version of the Flash player, you simply run the application. But if you have the player but you don't have the right version, the user will then be prompted to install or upgrade the Flash player. Now, it's important to note at this point that the user must have administrative access to their own client computer in order to install or upgrade the Flash player. Because the Flash player is either an ActiveX control running on Internet Explorer or a plugin running under other browsers, the user must be able to install local software in order to do this upgrade or install. The next section of the HTML wrapper is responsible for actually running the application. Starting at line 80 in the version of the HTML wrapper I'm displaying, there's a call to a JavaScript function called acflRunContent. Notice that it's passing in the src attribute of travel request. That's translated by this JavaScript function call as the name of the SWF file or compiled application that should be displayed. There's one other section in the JavaScript area here called the alternate content. This section of code executes only if the user doesn't have the Flash player installed or doesn't have the minimum version of the Flash Player that's required to do an automatic upgrade to Flash Player 9. There's one other section at the bottom of the file called the No Script section, which repeats the instruction to run the Flash Player and open the application, but does so in pure HTML code rather than with JavaScript. Hopefully this little bit of code never executes, because when it does, especially under Internet Explorer, the user has a somewhat cumbersome experience where they have to click on the Flash component or press the spacebar to activate the application. Now this bit of code only executes if the user's browser actually does not support JavaScript, or if the user has gone into their browser security settings and disabled JavaScript. So this bit of code hardly ever actually executes, but it's there just in case. So that's a look at the HTML file. Now, as I mentioned earlier, you never actually change the HTML file itself. Instead, you make changes to how your Flex application loads by modifying something called the HTML template. The HTML template file is stored in the HTML template directory, and it's named index.template.html. I'm going to open it with the text editor and show you that it has the same basic code as the generated file, but throughout this version of the file, wherever you see a $sign and then braces wrapped around a variable name, that's a value that's replaced during the code generation process. If you want to make a change to the way your application looks, you make the change here in the index.template.html file. And then during the compilation process, those changes are transferred to the generated version of the file in the bin debug directory. So that's a high-level look at how the compilation process works. The HTML template file contains the model, and then that model is implemented for each application in a generated version of the HTML wrapper that's placed in the bin debug directory. And finally, the Swift file, which is the compiled application, is placed in the same bin debug directory and is available for testing. At the end of this video series, I'll show you how to actually create what we call a release version of a Flex application, one that's suitable for deployment to a web server and for sharing with your users. But for most of your application development process, you'll use the version in this bin debug directory. And just remember that this is not the version that you'll be actually deploying to the website.